president of the Single Tax Corporation, and he's going to talk to us about how his family got here and from there on up. Okay, Charlie, take it away.
Well, my great-grandfather entered the country illegally. However, he later did become a naturalized citizen, but he was running away from home. He was born in Sweden and didn't like the occupation of his the father that raised him, and he was a cobbler, and he didn't want to be a shoemaker. So he stowed away on a ship, got caught in mid-Atlantic, and was going to be turned over to the authorities. So when they came into Pensacola in the middle of the night, he jumped over and swam ashore and came to Baldwin County.
Good gracious. And how old was he?
12. He was 12 years old.
What year was that about?
The best I can figure out, Ruth, it was around 1840, somewhere in that neighborhood. And he wound up.
And what was his last name? His name?
Winberg.
Winberg. Okay.
And they have even gone and found his birth records. I understand, traced it back a few years ago when they were trying to trace the family tree. And when he got as far as Point Clear and ran under the water again, he was living in the woods, and a crew of the Nelsons were working timber, I don't know, turpentine or lumber or something, and they found him living in a hollow tree. And he was hungry and scared to death and all this good stuff, and they took him in. And then he married, and his for a long time we couldn't figure. We knew there was Indian blood in the family, but in those days nobody liked to claim that. And in fact, it was a no-no for whites and Indians to marry. And one of my uncles, trying to trace the Indian heritage, found the marriage records in Linden, Alabama, in the courthouse. And on the marriage certificate it says, gives his name, and Keturah Nelson, a half Indian woman. Written on, and I suspect that nobody can figure out why. He never owned any land up there. He never worked up there. Why they were married in Linden, Alabama, nobody could figure out. And I said, hey, that's kind of obvious. They weren't real proud. I mean, they probably couldn't get married in Baldwin County, or at least it was not going to be looked on very favorably.
Possible, yeah.
And anyhow, that's then he had a son, Lawrence Winberg, who was my grandfather, and then my mother's mother came from Kansas when she was a young girl with her aunt and uncle. She was an orphan and being raised by her aunt and uncle, and came to landed at Battles Wharf about a year, maybe 2 years after the founding of the Single Tax Corporation, and they settled at Euclid in Section 28, I believe, in it, Ruth?
Yeah.
And then they had 6 or 7 children.
And their name was?
My mother's name was Sadie Winberg Ingersoll.
Your grandma's maiden name was?
My Anna Landis.
Oh, Anna Landis, yeah.
And Jack Gregson was her uncle that she came down here with. There, the Gregsons and the Landises and some of the Winbergs are buried in the College Cemetery, but my great-grandfather is buried at Point Clear in the cemetery in the subdivision down there in Lakewood. Then my father came to Fairhope in the early 20s, around 1920, 21, and he was 15 years old. His father was looking for a place to retire, and he had tried California and went out to an aunt of his in California, and she had homesteaded some land of all places near Barstow in the middle of the desert, and the temperature extremes there aggravated his arthritic condition even worse. So he went back to Iowa, and he'd been a cattle farmer and fattened cattle for market, and he'd met Joseph Fells in Chicago at Stockyards, Fells Nap Soap Company, and he was buying tallow to make soap out of, and so he became acquainted with him, and Mr. Fells recommended he come to Fairhope and spend a winter, and he did. And the next year he moved down here. And my father, being a minor, 15 years old, and was just recovering from scarlet fever, he came with them. He had an older brother that remained, and I still have cousins that live there. But they were not part of this original single tax group from Iowa. He's from southwestern Iowa, and the rest of them came from the northern part of the state. I guess around Des Moines.
Des Moines is not very far north. It's sort of middle.
Oh, yeah, but see, this is right in the southwest corner, almost on on St. Joe, Missouri, or right across the line. Gerardo, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, is the closest town. My father grew up in Villisca, Iowa. The school he went to school in is still there. It looks like it was built last year. I can't believe how well the buildings have been maintained. But anyhow, he moved to Fairhope, and he
and that would have been in
around 1920. And he wound up going to work with. We worked a little while with a plumber, and I believe his name was Boise or something like that. And then he went to work with Mr. Dyson, and was his finished carpenter. And the first house that my mother and father moved into when they got married was on Morphy Avenue. I don't know what number it is. The house right behind the Delta Mart that I believe is an eye doctor in there now. The Stewart family, Uncle Billy Burmaster. Oh, yeah. And the Stewart boys grew up there with their Aunt and Uncle Billy Burmaster. Yeah. Well, that was my father's first house. And I paid cost him $900.
Good old days.
Yeah. And my brother was born in that house, and then he sold that one to Billy Burmaster and moved across the street and built that Spanish style house that's now a veterinary clinic around the orange looking stucco house. And that's where I and my sister were born.
Yeah. Well, then you lived across the street from the Lees.
Next door.
Oh, next door.
They were the next house west.
Yeah, but that was after you moved out of the Burmeister.
That's when we moved on the other side.
Yeah.
And it's right between the Lee house and what's now the Fairhope Florist.
Yeah, right.
And Minnie house was right behind it.
Yeah. And she was Mary Heath Lee, who was a librarian in Fairhope, right?
I knew she was a librarian. I didn't know much about the Lee family. I was born there in 1931, and we moved down on Highway 32 for a short time, and then moved back into town, and then we moved out, started there and moved out on Blue Island Avenue, what is now Blue Island.
Oh, really?
Yeah, on 10 acres of single tax land.
Okay.
But my grandfather that came from Iowa thought single taxes were crazy. Just like it was an idea that just wouldn't work. And of course my grandfather Winberg was an early member. He was not a charter member, but a very early member. And he thought very highly of the idea. So I grew up in a family where my grandfather Winberg lived with us a good bit, and he and my father would argue about the theory. And
you had a typical childhood then, because that's what happens in Fairhope. Everybody gets together and they'll find something to argue about.
That's for sure.
Well, I grew up not really knowing much about Single Tax Corporation. Then got in high school, and we went through a period where the organic school had a teacher who was had a very socialistic influence, and I thought that's what single tax was all about. So I was very opposed to it. And you've heard me refer to myself as the St. Paul of the single tax movement. I would have loved to have just gotten rid of it at one point in my life. Spent the early part of my life trying to figure out a way to get rid of it. And then finally got out of the dairy business. We grew up I was in the dairy business with my father and my brother for 35 years. I bought Fairhope Laundry and Cleaners, which is situated on a single tax leasehold, and I purchased the laundry and became a lessee, and that put a whole nother slant on the problem.
Well, before you get to that part, let me find out how you got from Blue Island down to Greeno Road.
In 1945, my father purchased almost 80 acres on Greeno Road.
Okay.
And we moved the dairy to Greeno Road. We'd been driving the cows back and forth for 2 or 3 years, and I could spend the rest of the afternoon telling you about the dairy experiences and all that. But you know, Greeno Road wasn't even paved until 1953, and up until 1945, latter part of 45, we were still driving cows back and forth from.
Good heavens, from Blue Island out to Greeno.
Yeah, right now, you know where Taney Brazil's office is now? That was my home, and the dairy was right the next house south of that. And we drove those cows from there up Greeno Road, single file. I had a dog that, boy, she stood at the end of the line and watched him, and she barked one time, the old cow get back in line, and drove them all the way. I could turn her loose with them after I really got her trained, and I could stay there. We were using 2 old cement silos that are still standing out there to put silage in, and we hauled it from there and fed them silage up on the property on Blue Island. And you could turn her loose with them. She'd have them all in the corner ready to go in the holding pen at Blue Island when I'd get there.
How about that?
That was an amazing dog.
Yeah, that is amazing.
But that's how we got from Blue Island to
Okay.
Greeno, and then the dairy business in Baldwin County was very much encouraged during World War II. The federal government started encouraging dairy production along with the University of Auburn, or it was called Alabama Polytechnic Institute at that time.
That's right.
And that my father got into encouragement that way, and all during high school years, we were doing well in the dairy, making a living in the dairy business. And by the time I graduated in 1950, there were 150 or 125 grade A dairies in Baldwin County. Ours had the number 2 permit. We were the 2nd grade A dairy in Baldwin County.
Ours was number 11.
And then Mr. Willie Cooper's was number 1. And in 1950, we were doing all right. All the predictions by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and everything was that there's going to be a worldwide shortage of food within 20 years. And agriculture is the place to be in the economy. And I made a decision not to go to college based on the fact that what additional education I needed in agriculture or dairy science, I could get working in it and self-education, which turned out to be true. The thing that wasn't true was all these so-called experts did not factor in improvements in technology, improvements in transportation, the interstate highway system, and the improvement in the stainless steel holding tanks or milk tank trucks that you can, without any refrigeration, they're just a big thermos bottle that you can load milk in Wisconsin at 34 degrees and 2 days later be in Robertsdale, Alabama with it at 36 degrees. No rise in bacteria count. I mean, but prior to that, you just couldn't do that. And so there's no way from a natural fertility of the soil in this area, it just doesn't compare with Wisconsin, Iowa, parts of Iowa, Illinois, and the dairy belt, Minnesota. They can grow more alfalfa hay up there by accident than we can grow anything to feed them down here, working
with
at
lots
it
of fertilizer and
with tons of
pesticides.
fertilizer. And so you just couldn't compete. and at the same time, butterfat and milk products were taking a bad rap from the health folks, and from 1950 until present day, the dairy industry has been in steady decline until today. There's only 3 dairies left in Baldwin County out of 150. And I said that's the worst life decision I ever made, based on supposed to be the best information that was available at the time. However, I'd do it again. I look at the class I graduated with, and some of them have gone off. One of them became a doctor, and as I told our teachers when we had our 25th or 40th reunion, we turned out pretty good. We only had 1 doctor, no lawyers, and 1 preacher.
How many were in your graduating class?
65. I
That was
graduated from Fairhope High School. Now, there were probably around 15 or 20 kids that graduated that same year from ordained school. I'm not sure of that number.
That's about right, I think.
Anyhow, those, as I look now, sitting here at 63 years old, I wouldn't trade places with any of my classmates, and I don't think any have been any more successful. I know they haven't had as much fun, because I've lived in Fairhope all the time. And the ones that have made more money, quote unquote, I don't know that they have any more of it left now than I do, but they had to go somewhere else to do it, and I didn't. I've enjoyed life raising 4 kids here in Fairhope. Got a good education from Fairhope High School, taught me how to read and write and do a little bit of math, and that's all that's necessary, you know. And
nowadays, you got to know all about computers and all kinds of things.
well, believe it or not, Ruth, with the limited education I got, I put Fairhope Laundry and Cleaners on the computer.
Oh,
it was difficult. But
Well, all you got to know is what button to push.
well, you got to be able to read the manual, you know.
Yeah, right.
That's true.
And of course, some of these things, I think they're written in Japanese. Kind of hard to understand. The computer cash registers we got, oh gosh, it lost me some of the best employees I had. I just couldn't cope with the thing.
Oh, dear.
But yeah, I really don't feel like, I feel like I've done as well as, I'm satisfied with the life I've had right here in Fairhope. For 63 years, I wouldn't change it.
That's good. They say if they all put our troubles out in a pile, and each person would go back and pick their own troubles back again. So maybe that's the same with lives.
Yeah. Every time I look around and think I got a problem, I start looking around. But man, I find somebody's got so many more real problems that mine seem real small. No, Fairhope's been a wonderful place to live and do business.
That's what my kids say, that they just really appreciated growing up here.
And getting back to tracking me and how I wound up being president of Fairhope Single Tax Corporation is probably, would make a book. After I bought Fairhope Laundry and Cleaners, Claude Arnold came to me and asked me to consider taking classes in single tax. I said, man, you gotta be kidding. My name's Ingersoll. And my father had a problem over some property and came near a lawsuit, and it was even mentioned in this lawsuit that we got into. I guess 1985 was when we finally settled that thing, or went to court with it. The Hoffer and Fleming et al. Lawsuit.
Rezner's name was on it.
Rezner, yeah, he's the fellow that filed it, and that's that story. My story in that situation would be really interesting.
Well, we're here.
I identified more with them. They were all farmers. We all worked together. We traded work. We put up silage at the Fleming farm, at the Hoffer farm, and then moved to ours, or well, whoever was ready first, and we swapped equipment and labor and everything else. And I never did quite figure out how my father and those guys figured out who owed who what when it got through, but very little money changed hands. But Yep, it's been an interesting life.
Well, was the lawsuit filed in '85 or
No, it was filed earlier than that, but it came to trial. I got elected president of the Single Tax Corporation in February, and in November we went to trial.
That was in '85.
In '85,
okay.
I believe. But Claude came to me and asked me to take the class, and I thought it was funny.
And when did you buy the laundry?
In 1974.
Okay.
We started March the 1st, 1974.
Okay.
Bought it from Junior Mills. And
so you
that was
weren't
my first.
interested in
That was my first single tax leasehold in my name. And so I was interested in what's going to happen to it. There was considerable concern among people like Mr. E.B. Gwynn, who had his Bensold Gwynn business located on it, and he was concerned about what was going to happen to the town, to the downtown area, because it's all on single tax, and we were beginning to see the growth to Greeno Road, where more of that area will be deeded land than single tax land. However, it's real interesting that the first shopping center went on single tax land out there. And the town itself, as you look back, it developed first on single tax land. So that tells me folks had confidence in it. And I had many conversations with Mr. Gwynn when I first bought Fairhope Laundry and Cleaners about he was so worried about what was going to happen to the downtown, and my idea was there wasn't anything going to happen to it. I had seen the really viable businesses here, such as Fairhope Hardware and Fairhope Pharmacy and Bensold Gwynn and those places. They weren't in any trouble financially from sales. Their sales were good. They were looking at it from a prospect of standpoint of what other towns, small towns, had done. But other small towns didn't have two things Fairhope, Alabama had. Number one, they don't have the bay sitting down there that you got to travel Fairhope Avenue to get to, and which has been public lands given by the Single Tax Corporation and preserved as public land. And as long as that exists, there's going to be traffic on Fairhope Avenue, and the value of it may change in its character of business, but it'll never decline unless there is some tremendous upheaval, in my opinion, in our economy. And then we all in trouble. Yeah, it won't make any difference whether you're Gale Road or Barnwell or Fairhope or Bay Minette. But in this recent pictorial history that's come out, the writer refers to Fairhope's second founding, and I take exception to that.
When was that?
Well, they call it when Jim Nix was elected mayor, and compare it to the refounding of Fairhope. And I say, when I bought that, he got elected in '72. I bought Fairhope Laundry and Cleaners in '74, but I've been doing business in the dairy business in Fairhope. I've been here all my life, and I never noticed the decline of Fairhope. In my opinion, it never declined. In fact, it kept doing facelift on the front of the buildings, and
every time we had a hurricane,
things.
it got better. Every time we had a hurricane, everybody had to redo their storefronts, so
well, they modernized Fairhope Hardware. Now, some people don't like the 50s decor that they put in it, nor it's the same as on my Fairhope Laundry and Cleaners building that Mr. Mills put on there about the same time frame. But the point I'm making is that every year, for as long as you go back to 1950, there was some remodeling and facelifting done in Fairhope. Granted, the tree planting and the flower plant didn't start until much later than that. It started after I bought Fairhope Laundry and Cleaners, but really started out as a Rotary Club. A couple of people in Rotary Club wanted to get that. Were looking for a community project to do, and they started the tree planting, and it took off. That's also a result. You didn't used to build a house and put out instant grass, I call it, have an instant lawn. Banks wouldn't have loaned any money to do that. They'd have told you you're crazy. But with the increase in technology in the nursery business, and just for instance, azaleas and camellias, you used to have to dig them and transplant them a certain time of year. They plant them in a pot now, and you can move the blasted things anytime you want to, if you keep them watered. And it made it much more much easier to do, and much less expensive to do, much less labor involved in having in modern machinery again. They learned to cut that grass and lay it out like a carpet and water it, and you got instant grass.
During the 1960s, we could watch by the transfers, and we could tell that things were starting to happen, especially they had in the 50s, and that was of course right after the war, and the war was kind of a stalemate almost, except when people
Well, it put everything on hold, Ruth, to take care of a common problem.
Right.
That's right.
And then again, one of the things that happened in this era that they call the refounding, one thing that happened was we finally got that lawsuit settled. And that was my main reason for getting involved in the single tax in the first place, go see what it's all about. Was it didn't make any difference to me who was right or who was wrong in that situation. It was fixing to destabilize the economy of the city of Fairhope when you had 1,100 leaseholds at that point in time, most of which were people who had their homes on it, and that was the largest investment. The average person's largest investment, or most of his assets, are tied up in his home. And these people on most of these single tax leaseholds were in their elder years, most of them, getting on towards retirement. And it suddenly occurred to me that no matter who was right or wrong, if this corporation were to be dissolved, as what was attempting to be done then, that we would destabilize the economy and certainly hurt those 1,100 lessees for about 25 to 50 years, trying to figure out who owned what. And would have, if there was ever anything that scared me about the economy of Fairhope, it was that lawsuit, when I suddenly realized what was fixing to happen. And I got into the Single Tax Corporation to protect my own interest. And then I got hooked on the idea and realized what a viable idea it was, and how much inefficiency we could eliminate in the collection of taxes. Single Tax Corporation, or the single tax idea, or land value taxation idea, will not correct the problems that we face in government today. If we were on a single tax basis for financing our government, we still got the problem of Congress spending more money than they take in, and any tax, be it on land, income, or whatever, can be burdensome to an economy and ruin an economy if government takes too much away from the guy who's producing. And you've got too few producers for the number of users.
Well, then it's really the waste that is doing it.
The waste and making people become dependent on government.
And special privilege.
And the main ingredient in this town, other than the natural setting with the bay that I just mentioned, is the fact that there are many, many people over many, many years who have been single taxers, or whether they were single taxers or not single taxers, they were very conservative people, believed in taking care of themselves, as our early ancestors who came down here did. And that conservatism and paying as you go, taking care of yourself, has just passed from one generation to the next here in Fairhope. And I think that has just the influence of our gene pool has made a tremendous difference in this community. It's something you can't really put a finger on, but the Single Tax Corporation has played a major role in that, in attracting, for instance, Mr. Bells, who encouraged my grandfather to move here. While he never lived here, he encouraged those kind of conservative people to come here, and he's just one of many, I'm sure.
Didn't he donate a lot of money either to the school or to the corporation?
He bought
some
land
yeah.
and gave it to the corporation.
Well, one of the things that he did was put up money for the boat, which was a necessity, because that was the only outlet we had. And also, he helped the organic school and he helped the library.
That's it. So he was just
So he helped the
involved in
community
everything.
directly and indirectly.
Well, and you said, and that brings me to mind, you know, we've got people, so diverse a group of people, and when I ran on this phrase that Mr. E.B. Gaston Cohen talking about cooperative individualism, man, I love that statement, because we got people at both ends of the spectrum somehow or another that seem to get along in Fairhope, put up with each other, and you know, just give each other room. Because the three of us disagree with each other, but at least we can be civil to each other. And
like I say, Fairhope has grown on the friction of differences of opinion that if you voice them, then you can work them out.
right. And we have been a little microcosm, I guess, of the United States, in a way it was founded on coming from many, many backgrounds and coming together to form a new society or a different society. And this is one of the things that discourages me on the national scene when I hear people talking about multiculturalism and preserving this culture and that culture. And I'm a 32nd Indian, and it pains me when I hear Indian people talking about them being, they were the first residents. Sure they were, but we're all residents of the planet, and you adapt to the conditions you find yourself in. And
yeah, you either adapt or try to change. You don't just
adapt.
accept everything lying down.
Yeah, but you never make it just like you want it. If you can't blend in, then you're in for a tough life.
There were a lot of Indians that really suffered. I mean, they were demolished.
I've seen so many of the farmers, people my age, that stuck in agriculture when it was evident that it was down the tube in Baldwin County, and refused to change. And it hasn't been easy for me to change, but I finally decided, hey, if you're going to eat 3 times a day and don't want to be dependent on the government, you better get with it, boy. Find you something else to do. And what a change from agriculture to the dry cleaning business, and now I'm interested in a little furniture manufacturing operation in a limited way. But boy, my life has been one big compromise and change after another. But when I looked at my friends and peers who didn't change or tried not to change until it was too late, terrible.
There's nothing but constant except change.
That's right. Nothing stays the same.
A lot of the people that were in this lawsuit that were fighting the hardest have gained the most because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I came to realize that once at one point I was listening to the opposition to the Single Tax Corporation, and I could appreciate where they were coming from, but it became evident to me that instead of trying to kill it, they should have been trying to change it. It's almost like going to war. Almost always nobody wins.
Well, do you have any comments on the lawsuit or anything you want to record for posterity? This is your chance, or at least one chance.
Well, this tape isn't long enough.
We have another one.
And I've been saying that Gale Rowe and Charles Ingersoll need to sit down with somebody that writes and write a book and talk about the things that really went on behind the scenes, the compromises that this corporation was willing to make to settle that lawsuit. and it was rejected by the plaintiffs that would have given them control of this corporation. And I am so happy today that they didn't accept the compromise settlement, that I don't know what to do. At that point in time, I didn't like it, but it was the majority opinion of those of us who were sitting at that defense table that we needed to try to settle that thing, and we offered that. And then when that was rejected, we had no alternative but to carry it to its ultimate conclusion, the Supreme Court, and we won. There were a couple of points we lost, but insignificant as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I thought it was amazing how well the important things were preserved.
Right. I've come to have a great appreciation for the then Chief Justice, his name's escaping me now.
Yeah.
Talbert.
Oh, yeah.
Judge Bo Talbert. I came to find out after our appeal and talking with him when he got to the place that he could talk, that he had studied the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation even before that lawsuit came into being.
Well, that speaks well for him.
And one of his first statements to me was he was amazed how well our Constitution was written and how well it had stood up to the test of 2 Supreme Court challenges. He had great praise for the original writers of our Constitution.
They were smarter than they knew, I believe.
Yes, I don't think they really realized how good a job they were doing.
Because how could they foretell what was going to go on?
Hindsight's 20/20.
I mean, when they made it, they were living on an idea, and they didn't have any way of knowing that the practical application that they put together would last like that.
You know, changing the subject a bit again, and you're talking about how it lasts. The things that we're enjoying today, and that you see people that have just moving into the community in the last few years that are talking about what great things they are, and that have come to be in the last 10 to 15 years, were started much earlier than that. They weren't new ideas. We just got around to the place we could finally afford them. For instance, our golf course. Look how many years ago Barney Shull and Dr. Moon Mullins, my wife was working for him, and Moon was one of H.C. Mullins. Dr. Mullins was one of the early pushers for that thing. He and Barney Shull worked on that a long time. Brought up and turned down a couple of times.
But now that you've mentioned golf course, what happened to the golf course that the single taxers started out
Well,
here?
it was just a 9-hole course, and it had sand greens.
Okay.
And during World War II, it fell into disrepair. Nobody played it, and that's one of those periods that I don't really know a whole lot about the history of the Single Tax Corporation, but the wisdom of the corporation at that time, or its board decided to subdivide it, that it wasn't getting enough use as a public golf course.
It had been really completely given
And it
up.
was surrounded by housing development. There was no place for it to grow into a larger golf course. And as you know, after every a round of golf, somebody has to drag that sand trap with and they did it by hand. This guy would drag a big old heavy drag, and my golf career was real short. Jimmy Nelson, myself, and Scott Clemens were down in the gully gathering golf balls all the time, finding golf balls left down there, and we had a stick that we made a club out of, and we were out there putting, and that guy that drug those greens all the time took a real dim view of us out there putting on his golf green. We had to run for our lives. That was the end of my golfing career.
So mainly that golf course was for modern times, so to speak, was too small and not
That's right.
kept up there.
Well,
in the right
it's like
place.
a lot of things that you and I grew up with the skating rink down there, but during World War II it fell into disrepair. You know, had dances and stuff down there, no Burke Hills and
Well, I went to
and the
dances out at the
casino.
golf club. That's what I was thinking
right.
about.
That
when
was
you
one of the early teen center things,
Yeah.
youth recreation attempts in this town. And here it's revived again, and somebody got the idea. It's a new idea, but it's been tried several times in my lifetime, and it fails every time for lack of parental involvement.
Yeah, that's so.
Well,
Or,
they want
another
want somebody else to do it.
Yeah, I wonder sometimes if we want kids to like the kind of places we want to provide for them rather than providing the kind of place that they would like to have. And of course we have to have a certain amount of control over it, but I don't know what the problem is exactly.
That seems to be a problem that goes on and on forever and ever,
That's
everywhere,
right.
everywhere in the world. But I don't have an answer to that one.
one of the things that seemed to me like that when the young people were really enjoying themselves, the old people just couldn't stand it.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And they were so suspicious. How could they have so much fun?
Yeah.
And
not be up to something bad.
Right. And so then they would try to get something to happen to it.
But the point I wanted to make about these things coming along as we could afford them, the ideas were here, and to say that any one man, including E.B. Gaston, and I will always believe that E.B. Gaston has more influence perhaps than any other one man in this town. But this town hasn't been built in the tradition by any one man. It's been a very broad spectrum of people that have caused this town to be what it is.
A very, very broad spectrum of people and of thought and of financial background, and some of the people that were really well off and some people that were really hard up didn't care if they lived side by side.
That's somebody.
That's true.
Oh, it was one of the Broadbeck wives. Can't think of her name right now. Wrote an article a few years ago, and she pointed that out and said what sets Fairhope apart, in her opinion, was the very fact that you just mentioned. There'd be a $100,000 house, just picking numbers out of there, right next to a $35,000 or $40,000 house. There is no other side of the tracks to Fairhope. And she called it a very homogeneous community, and that's exactly what it was. You don't cram, and that's one of the things that worries me today. We're building subdivisions with the big iron gates, and everybody's house has got to be of a certain price range. And
Well, that's happening at Old Fairhope now. Bigger houses are being built on top of little houses, or added on to
Right.
little houses.
Fairhope is definitely changing its character, and I'm not happy to see all of it. But then I don't guess anybody that ever reaches our age that hadn't thought that the younger generation was going to hell in a handbag.
That's right.
Another thing, also, the more there are of the big houses, and they need service people, and so we're getting more and more mobile homes that is what they can afford, because they get a small
There's nothing wrong with a mobile
income.
home.
And that yet the big people don't like the little
They don't want a mobile home
homes.
next door to them, that's
No.
for sure.
And they ought to be thankful for them.
But, there's no place in the world, I don't think, except Fairhope, where you would see a house, the one across from the city library complex right now, that was in excess of $300,000, built right next to the cemetery, a gully, and the city complex. And the house has changed hands 3 or 4 times now, and has never decreased in value. Each time it transfers for a little more than it did the time before. So Fairhope is one place that real estate values never decrease. They may level out, but it don't ever seem to decrease. But a couple of there's several characters stand out in my memory that are big in my, affected me a lot, I think, in my early years, was Uncle Art Michon. He was the superintendent of our Sunday school, First Christian Church, which I understand E.B. Gaston was a member of that church.
Yeah, it was the only church in Fairhope.
Right, it was the first church and only church for a while.
For not quite a
And
while.
my grandmother was a charter member of that church, and she really was a member of the Church of Christ, what she said she was baptized into, but she was a very active member of that church. And then there was a man named John Huffman. You talk about people who have community spirit. I was a member of the first Fairhope High School band, and Mr. John Huffman bought most of the instruments, the tubas, the bass drums, the baritones, the French horns, and my trombone. I rented from him for $3 a month.
That's wonderful. I never heard that story. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Well, John Huffman
Johnny
loved music, as did Marmaduke Dyson. Marmaduke played cornet, and he took my doctor, or my first band teacher, Novak, Mr. John Novak, came down here, and he was a professional musician. And he came into the Fairhope Hardware and was looking for a job, and Mr. Dyson was interviewing him, and he found out he played cornet. And he said, "Oh, you know, that's my instrument." And he said, "I want to give you to Fred Ingersoll and see if he can make a carpenter out." Yeah. Well, popped me back out very well making a carpenter out of Mr. Novak. But when I came along, the first band I was in was not a part of the curriculum of Fairhope High School. It was made up of students from anywhere on the Eastern Shore, but primarily Fairhope High School and Organic School. Hans Reuter, you remember Hans?
Yeah, that's right.
He played cornet, and then Frank Laraway, I think, was playing clarinet, maybe. Anyhow, there was several organic school kids in our first
Edna
band.
was in that, but I don't know. She played piano, so I don't know whether she played, but she sang.
Who?
Edna Rockwell.
Okay, she was a little bit ahead of me, I guess, in that.
Yeah,
But the first
yeah.
band that I was in, the first one that was in the Fairhope High School, but I'd been in the band a year or two before it became a part of the curriculum. And the Lindsays, do you remember?
Oh, yeah.
Ms. Lindsay? Her and Mr. Lindsay held the band parents club. They were the band parents club.
Yeah.
And he had a truck that he put a body on to haul men up to the reserve fleet, the maintenance guys up there. And that's what he hauled us around all over the place on. And our first marching band that we put on the street in Mardi Gras Parade Mobile, there were 23 of us in it.
How about that?
And he hauled us over there.
And that had to be in the, you graduated in 1950?
50.
50, so that was 48 to 50, somewhere along there.
Let's see, I was in about maybe 3 years, so it would have been I graduated in 50, yeah, 47.
Okay.
Started in the band in 47. Started playing bass drum. They couldn't find, they were looking for a dumb kid to play bass drum, and they got me. And then I decided I really wanted to learn a little music, and I took trombone 2 years for Mr. John Novak before I graduated. So, anybody that says that, you know, that they can talk about education being behind all they want to in Alabama, but we made out pretty good.
Yeah, we did. We had more family
got the
involvement
basics.
when we were growing up.
One of the things that happened, that they had so many programs where they would have a speaker, or of course E.B. would speak at the drop of a hat, and
You see, he was dead before I knew him.
Well, he died in 38.
38. See, I was born in 31, so I was only about 7 years
the
old.
same year that Marietta Johnson died,
Right.
or within a year.
But you know, going back to experiences, one of the things that really upset me when I was in high school, I was co-editor of the Broadcaster with Buddy Cotton, and he was a illustrator or cartoonist, and this guy was a very good artist. And In fact, he made a living for a long time with Poser Printing Company doing all of their graphics. And then he decided to go into the ministry. And he was doing the typeset. His father was a printer. And so he was doing the illustration and the cartoons, and I was the editorial writer for the broadcast at that time. And the Organic Merry-Go-Round, Frank Laraway and Don Rockwell were my age, and they were writing all this stuff about we ought to nationalize all the industries in this country and everything. And this was the influence that this guy wore. And so I would write these editorials answering their editorials, and I couldn't never get them printed. And our faculty advisor was the principal's wife, Amelia Bennett. And after about the third one of my editorials got torn up, I said, what in the world is the matter? Is there something grammatically wrong? What's wrong? She said, we don't want to upset the Single Tax Corporation. I said, what? She says, well, they support the organic school, and we don't want this kind of controversy. We're not going to allow this kind of controversy. I said, what happened to freedom of speech?
Yeah.
And
they could never get away with that today if a student decided to.
Well,
take
I
it to
can
court.
guarantee you what my father's reaction would have been if I'd gone home and wanted to sue a teacher.
That's
I'd have been
true,
standing
that's
up
true.
taking meals for a long time. Boy,
Somebody
when I got in trouble at school, the last thing I was going to do was go home and tell my papa that. No, he took the position they were right and I was wrong until he went and investigated. And then he said, you probably did something to cause it.
Well, that's not the only thing the Bennetts were guilty of, so I guess we won't dwell on it.
Well, the Single Tax Corporation apparently had been generous to the public school system also.
Well, your editorials would not have offended the Single Tax Corporation because they had no bearing on the Single Tax Corporation.
I know it, but I didn't.
You didn't
Hey,
know
I
it
was a
then.
teenager,
I know,
okay?
I know,
And I grew up again like Paul, the writer of most of the New Testament.
Neither would they have gone along wholeheartedly
That's
with the other side
right,
of
with
the
the
That's right.
organics, but they wouldn't have censored them either.
That's right.
But I was terribly upset about the censor job I was getting, and therefore it just destroyed my interest in writing anything. I hardly wrote anything after that, and we just got through the year. You know, we wrote about nothing. Well,
What they wanted, that's exactly what they
right.
wanted.
Well, isn't that the way you get through school? You figure out what your professor wants and give him what he wants.
That's right. That's exactly. You didn't have any choice.
Fortunately, for the academic subjects, I had good teachers. I had a man in science that who taught chemistry and physics, who had worked on the first atomic bomb at Oak Ridge, and he was a very brilliant man.
Who was that?
James R. Morgan,
Okay.
and everybody thought he was a freak. You know, he rode his bicycle. I mean, he was unusual, like so many other characters in Fairhope. He was a little bit different.
To his credit.
Yeah, but he had very small classes. My chemistry class, we wound up with 6 in it, and 10 was the minimum you could make a class with, but they didn't figure it out at the office. 2 or 3 of them dropped out right away. We did have the minimum to start with, but we wound up with 6 in that class at the end of the first 6 weeks, and we were so far into it that the principal said, well, if I'd have known this at the beginning, y'all wouldn't have had this class. And I sure was glad we did have it. And then we had Jim Lipscomb came along, returning from World War II, and a guy by the name of, he was a math teacher, and the fellow just ahead of him, by the name of Caldwell, that was returning from World War II, and he was an excellent math teacher. Earl Hilliard came the year I was a junior, I believe. He started teaching at Fairhope High School, and he was teaching junior high math. And Earl, perhaps one of the best math teachers, he could explain it to kids better than I never had him for a teacher, but the reputation he had with my children and younger people was he's the best man. Some of my nieces and nephews, he was the best math teacher ever been in Fairhope High School from the standpoint of kids being able to grasp it. It's been a real experience.
Paula had a teacher. She was very young and female for math in the 9th grade that was just really, gifted that way. But she didn't teach very long.
Fairhope had this little custom of closing down on Thursday afternoon, and I always wondered where that came from. My grandmother said one time when I said, well, why did they close down on Thursday afternoon? She said, well, Uncle Art LaShawn caused that to happen. I said, why? She said, well, he loved baseball. And Saturday was their busiest day. People from out in the country came into town to trade, so they couldn't play on Saturday. And he was going to be in church on Sunday. He didn't play baseball on Sunday. So they decided to close town down on Thursday afternoon and play baseball.
Oh, well, that's the second version we've heard. We heard that the causeway, there was a charge for the causeway when they first opened, and on Thursdays you could go across for half fare. So that's why they started closing the stores on Thursday. So now we have two versions, so we'll just record that for history.
Uncle Art would have been a lot ahead of that. So maybe they were doing it all the time.
My grandmother said the worst, that he loved baseball, and I know he loved baseball. I remember that. But it shut down on Thursday afternoon, and I went to watch many of the games, and Fairhope had a pretty good semi-pro team at that time. And there were a lot of the
They played down on the beach, too.
They played down on the beach some, but my earliest memories of them were out on Stimson Field when there was more rock than it was sand, and you could skin your knees up good at that.
Well,
You think I can't think anything else to say, and that's, my gosh, I've used up enough tape for one character.
Well, that's only about an hour.
Really?
So, yeah. Okay, well, we'll turn it off for a minute.
Talk a little bit about I said so many people have had a part in Fairhope. Let's talk a little bit about the different city administrations that I've seen and what their contributions were, and how this town has been a pay-as-you-go town. It's always operated in the black, and that's been to the credit of every administration up to the present administration, that they have always been a pay-as-you-go town. And some of these improvements that have just recently come to be had their beginnings way back, and Fairhope has always been kind of a leader in building community, or ahead of the curve a little bit, as we still are in recycling and this sort of thing. But one of the early mayors that in my memory that was Mr. Snyder, who with his own bulldozer at times did improvements for the city, and one of the first things he did was to start improving the garbage situation in town, where they'd been dumping all the trash and garbage together and burning it, and people going through it and getting junk out of it, and our dairy with them was about a mile away from it, and the wind was in the right direction. Believe it or not, that garbage created more flies than a dairy did. And we were killing them faster. We couldn't kill them as fast as they were raising them over there a mile away from us. But when Mr. Snyder started covering and stopped the burning and started covering, and you find him if you want to find him early in the morning, you'd find him at about 6 o'clock down at the garbage dump, making sure that those guys had covered it from the day before, and he met them at the barn, and he most likely be in a pair of overalls.
Usually.
Yeah. And I used to hear about our uneducated mayor, and he couldn't talk and all that, but somehow or another he was able to communicate with the work crews, and they understood they had to work. And Mr. Snyder was had the foresight to buy the property that is now the City Park football stadium, and he was trying to get Faulkner College, before it was built in Bayonet, located in Fairhope. And he came to my father and was talking about that site, or perhaps buying our dairy farm on Greeno Road for that purpose. And Pop told me he didn't want to sell the dairy. And Mr. Snyder asked him what he thought about that property that he did buy, and he said, well, if you can get that Smith family of the blacks that live up there to sell it to you, that would be, I think it would be an excellent location for college. And Mr. Snyder was able to accomplish that and purchase it. He wasn't able to accomplish getting the college there to begin with, but it turned out to be a very good purchase for the city of Fairhope. There are a lot of small colleges love to have a football stadium that Fairhope High School plays on every Friday night.
Is that up there?
Yeah, it's in that. A lot of people laughed about him buying that piece of property with that gully right down through the middle of it, but that's where they built the football stadium, in that natural ravine.
I haven't been in that park in 30 years, I guess.
Well, y'all go look at it, because your father-in-law did a fine job the day he bought that piece of property.
Well,
and at one time they were talking about moving the city
well, that killed
facilities
him.
out there.
That's what got him not elected the next go around. Nobody wanted City Hall to move out to Greeno Road.
Yeah, besides that, Fairhopians have got to have somebody that's got a lot of spit and polish that Mr. Joe didn't have.
That's
He was
true.
just a down-to-earth guy, my kind of man. And then following him was Mayor Macon, and they had a city manager by the name of Brad Niemeyer, who did a lot of the day-to-day management. And
No, Brad was before Joe Snyder.
He served
Did
2
he come
times.
back? Okay,
Yes, he came back again. He was before Joe. He was during the Tony Clump administration, and then I think when your father-in-law came along, he
had Pete Burns, his city manager.
Yeah, and then Brad Niemeyer
Came back.
When Mayor Macon was elected. And under Mayor Macon, we built the city pier, and some folks were wanting to improve the sewage plant, and I was in favor of fixing the sewer plant is before the pier, but it got done the other way. And however, both of those projects were a little bit, nobody was forcing us to do those things. They were being done as funds were available, and on a pay-as-you-go system. And the idea of the golf course, for instance, was started back in Barney Scholl's first term on the city council. He and Dr. Mullins were pushing for a city golf course, because we had one at one time, the little 9-hole course. And they were looking at the piece of property that Quail Creek is now situated on. So, all these good things we look at today didn't just happen overnight. The idea started a long time ago, and we worked towards them and did them as we could. And again, I like that phrase that E.B. Gaston came up with, is cooperative individualism. Sometimes there's a lot more individualism than there is cooperativeness. But we've managed to live and work together without killing each other a long time. But during the Macon administration, the water system that's now east and south of Fairhope was started by Mr. Art Fleming and Wayne O'Hofford Sr. and Mr. F.A. Burmaster. And they came and met with my father, and because half a mile of that line would go run in front of Ingersoll Dairy. And my father saw the wisdom in doing that and promptly assigned me the job of helping them. And we created that. I don't remember the exact year, but it
Sometime in the 60s.
early 50s, or late 50s rather, or very early 60s, and we ran it until after I bought Fairhope Laundry in 1974. I think we ran about 12 years, so that would have been about
It was
62, somewhere along there, I guess, we 62, 63.
Joe Schneider was in from 60 to 64, that's why I was,
Well, it
dating
came
it
after
after.
it. Well, it must have been in the first year after that,
Okay.
that we went and borrowed money from the farmer's home. Went to Mr. Niemeyer, Mr. Fleming did, went to Mr. Niemeyer and was trying to get water run out Morphy Avenue. And Mr. Niemeyer suggested that he get some of his farm neighbors together and go to the Farmers Home Administration. It was he knew about that program and encouraged him to do it, and that's how it got started. And it took us about 2 years to get the minimum number signed up of 160. We had to have 163, and we wound up finally got 165 and went back to the Farmers Home Administration, and we had well over 100 of that 165. I think 105 or 6 of them were black families down off Twin Beach Road in that area. And they said, "Hey, wait a minute, this ain't gonna work." I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "Well, you're not gonna be able to make it. You got too many blacks on it for what whites you have. You're gonna have a credit problem." And I exploded. I said, "All this stuff you've made me sign that I'm not going to discriminate."
Yeah, yeah.
And I said, "You don't really want to do that, because we will enter a lawsuit against y'all for discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked too long and too hard to have it stop now." And as it turned out, we had a smaller percentage of those, because that spurred me to keep up with where our bad credit was. And we had less problems and less bad debt with the black customers on that system than we did with whites for the first couple of years. But then it quickly grew to the place that we had more white customers on it than we did black, because Fairhope was growing to the east. And at the end of the 12 years, we had about 650 customers on the system. We were the first system one of those systems in the state of Alabama that had operated in the black from day one. After we've been operating about 10 years, one of the leading councilmen of all time, in my opinion, in Fairhope was Mr. Sam Box. And Henry Bishop decided that the city of Fairhope needed to get in the water system out in that part of town. They wanted it back, and we got into an argument over the price of water, the wholesale price of water, because we had a contract with the city to read the meters and to do the maintenance and repair and any minor extensions that we'd done on it, and we'd done several to gain those number of customers. And the city up to that point was satisfied with the arrangement, and we were satisfied with the arrangement. But when they decided they wanted to own and operate that system, then when we tried to get them to give us a new contract on the price of water and furnish us with water, they first said they didn't have the capacity to pump it. And then they said they weren't making any money on the water, which I didn't feel like was correct. And we had the capacity to go borrow the money and put down the wells and the tanks and go in the water business. But none of the three of us really wanted to do that. We were farmers, and we didn't want to operate a water system. And we finally worked out an agreement where they took that system over. We turned over $150,000 in cash and 600 customers and got out of the water business, and it turned out good for Fairhope, and certainly I didn't want to be in the water business. May have been more lucrative than the laundry business though. But so I say again that no one individual has had a major role in this town other than E.B. Gaston. He's a standalone if there is one. And other than that, it's been just a very cooperative effort. However, our present administration, Jim Nix, has been a very able administrator. But he's had the cooperation and help of a lot of good council people over the years.
think E.B. Gaston was in a ideal situation for his disposition, because he was a good orator. He could talk very well, and he had the newspaper, and he just saw to it that everybody knew everything that was pertaining to what
Yeah,
he
but
was
I
working
admire
at.
his courage in picking up taking his life in an area like Iowa that was stable at that time, a good agricultural economy, and moving down to the south with the alligators and the snakes and the mosquitoes to a place that wasn't even accessible by land, hardly, and had the courage to come risk his whatever wealth he had and his family to start a new community based on this radical idea. Those of us, like people who've been moving in our present mayor, for instance, came along. This was all established, and every mayor of the city of Fairhope, beginning with number one, had the advantage of having these facilities turned over to them with little or no debt. And they've always been able to operate in the black. And for many, many years, many people on the Single Tax Colony Council also served on the city council, and so that influence extended into that. And
My grandfather was one of them. He was on the
Yes.
first city council. He was, of course, came down with the single. Well, he wasn't with them. He came and met them here, but he was on the first city council.
what else can
I'm
I
not
say?
trying to
Fairhope
belittle.
has a unique background.
Yes, that's for sure.
I wasn't trying to belittle E.B. Gaston. I was just saying that position that he held was helped everybody in getting the communication and knowing what was going on and having the feeling that they were all working together.
Oh yes, I mean he definitely believed, and everybody knew what was going on, and getting everybody's input, and that's where this. I mean, his phrase was cooperative individualism. That's evidently what he lived and believed. I wished I'd lived at the point in time I knew the man. He and the others that started this thing had great foresight. And I don't know whether we mentioned already or not the fact that Judge Talbert, I think we did that off camera a while ago, that Judge Talbert had, after the trial was all over, told me what great respect he had for the writers of our Constitution, and it had withstood these two Supreme Court tests.
Oh, the Single Tax Corporation's Constitution
Right,
you're referring to.
right.
Yeah. Bo Torbert, was that the
Yeah.
Supreme Court.
Supreme Court justice?
You know, he is now on the, I don't know what the exact status is right now, but he was on this committee to evaluate or recommend overhaul of our tax structure in the state of Alabama. That committee completed its work and turned in a report, and it was very little of it adopted, if any.
Yeah, 'cause
But he was very much involved in it. Bo Torbert has been very interested in the tax system in the state of Alabama. And I guess that's really one of his main interests in the Single Tax Corporation, because we have this little different idea about how you raise taxes.
yeah.
Okay. I think I've talked about it enough.
Well, you still got some tape. There's a little thing that flashes at me when we're running out of tape, so whatever you want to do.
I probably ought to be moving on to get the laundry delivered.
You think
before
you might ought to go out and
I need to
earn your
check on the
keep?
truck that's in the garage there now, that hope it's ready to go.
Well, we thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, one more shot at it, Charlie.
My father came down here at 50 years old, and people still remembered the Civil War.
Oh, yeah.
And he really wasn't welcome. And some of my mother's kinfolks really didn't like Yankees. And when they built their house down on 32, one of her ancestors, they drove up one Sunday afternoon, just ready to move in the house, and they were driving up, going down there to clean up and get ready to move, and they saw this guy start a fire on the back side of the 10-acre property. There was pine straw all over the ground, and they spent the rest of the afternoon fighting fire to keep from burning their house down. It was intentionally set. Yeah.
Well, that reminds me of Bob's granddad saying they told him to plant a whole ear of corn when he planted his farm. And he knew better than that because he had gardened and farmed up north, but he was from the north too.
Yeah, the Yankees really weren't too welcome, but this community was settled by Yankees. But
That's right.
you know, I really believe that was part of the reason that there was so much. Some people were so for the Single Tax Corporation, and others were against it. Was maybe some of that had something to do with it. But I grew up in a family where, in spite of the fact that my father wasn't real welcome at first, he soon got to be well liked and respected by my mother's family, and Harmon Pierce and him became great friends, and it was a Pierce that set the woods on fire.
Oh my.
It was not Harmon Pierce, but yeah, they became great friends, and all had a great respect for my father.
Well, that I never experienced prejudice in Fairhope as such.
I haven't either.
And well, I mean, and I wasn't taught to be prejudiced against people of a different color, and it took getting away from here to realize what my background, what Fairhope itself, the beginnings of Fairhope had probably contributed to that fact that it was not a big thing here. It was just not, racism was not a real big thing when you and I came along.
Well,
it was a racist community.
We practiced segregation.
That's right. It was segregated, but we didn't hate. I was never taught to hate.
It wasn't something. It wasn't that conscious with me, and I don't know what I believe, but I don't believe it. I believe the black race has a I don't care if things don't. They have their strengths and weaknesses, as do we, and I really don't know what I believe about that. God created them that way.
We're all human. That's right.
That's right. But when I got into service and ran into some of my Yankee buddies in basic training, they started telling me immediately how bad I was and how I mistreated blacks. And then when one of them that went all the way through the army, when we got to Korea, and he and I got put in a barracks. There were 14 men in there, and 2 whites and 12 blacks. I didn't have any problem, but he did. He had to go to the old man and get transferred out of there. And I had more fun teasing him. He was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I had more fun teasing him about being prejudiced.
Here I am with Gale Rowe, and he's the secretary of the Single Tax Corporation, and he's going to tell us for how long he's been secretary and all about how he came to Fairhope and anything else. Go ahead, Gale.
All right. Well, let's just start with when I came to Fairhope. I don't know the precise date. It was in late 1930, and I was with my mother and father. I was the only child. We had come to Fairhope. My dad had come to Fairhope to renew an acquaintance with Mr. Hopping, who was a member of the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation, and who had been a neighbor of his family, my father's family, in Glen Ellen, Illinois, in the early 1900s. And Mr. Hopping, or even before that, but Mr. Hopping was a single taxer interested in the Fairhope plan, and so he came south and stayed until he died in, I think, 28 or 29, something like that. Anyway, it was a surprise to my dad to find that he had passed on. My dad was very fond of him. He came to Fairhope right after World War I, and visited with Mr. Hopping a little bit on his way to Cuba. He was doing this. He was a young man and was interested in what was going on in Cuba, whatever it was. He never told me at the time, but when he got
Probably
to
the climate.
Well, it could have been. Could have been. He was looking for something to do,
Mm-hmm.
and he did wander around quite a bit in his younger days, anyway. When we arrived, we found out that Mr. Hopping had passed on, but we visited with his widow and with his son-in-law, Carl Bloxam, which is kind of interesting because Carl Bloxam was considered not to be much of a friend of the Single Tax Corporation.
Oh.
But as time went on, anyway, in any event, the father struck up an acquaintance with him. We stayed for a few days, and then we went on down to Florida, to St. Petersburg, Florida, and for the purpose of finding something to do. My dad had sold his business in Oak Park, Illinois. The business was in West Chicago, and we lived in Oak Park. It was the first one-stop service station for automobiles in Chicago, or at least in West Chicago. It started in the battery business, the tire and battery, and had then branched out. Well, things had gotten bad.
Like they had all
yeah,
over.
Right.
Yeah.
And he was able to get out satisfactorily for, I guess, as far as he was concerned. And then he was looking around for something to do. We spent about 6 weeks in St. Petersburg, and then we came back to Fairhope. And we didn't stay, but we stayed for a year or so. And while Dad was looking for things to do, never did find much to do, and he existed, or we existed, on his earnings in the stock market. Somehow or another, he was able to keep us some bread and butter doing that. And
He must have invested wisely at that
well,
time.
he did, and he tried to explain all that to me. As time went on, I never did catch on. But anyway, in 1932, we went up to Chicago to see the World's Fair, and following that, we went up to my grandmother's farm in Wisconsin, and I stayed there for a year while Dad went around the country. And he finally found a place in Pensacola, Florida, a service station. It was on the way from the Naval Air Station to downtown Pensacola, and he thought that'd be a good spot to have a service station. Opened up business there. And we stayed there until 1936, and we moved back to Fairhope. And my dad got a job with Tony Klump, and managed his tire and battery department in Klump's Motor Company. And he did that until
And what was your dad's name?
Henry Rowe,
That's right.
commonly known as Hank.
Yeah, I remember now.
Quite a few people remember him.
Yeah.
And I'm concentrating on that right now because that's how we happened to come to Fairhope, and that's again for a second time and to stay. When we came back from Pensacola, we had a farm out at the end of what is known as Nichols today, Bishop Road intersection there. It had a lot of pecan trees on it, and that's what we farmed. And I can remember catching a school bus into town to go
And
to school.
what grade were you in when you moved to Fairhope?
I was in the fifth grade. No, fifth.
Well, about that.
About the 6th or 7th grade, something
Uh-huh.
like that. I went to the public school. I wasn't allowed to go to the
Play
organic
school? People call it play school.
Well, I went over there for a few days, but my mother didn't like the way things were. They were very strict about my studying and grades and all that kind of stuff. So I ended up in the public school and graduated from the Fairhope Public School. And before I graduated, we moved into town, a place on Magnolia. When we were here before, we rented. We rented maybe 4 or 5 places. One of the things I remember in the summer of '31, I guess would be when the political conventions were going on, listening to the both the Republican and the Democratic national conventions. It seemed like a kind of a magical affair as far as the radio was concerned. The announcers really, knew how to color it so you could imagine just being there.
Mm-hmm.
Where do I want to go to next? My school years were not anything unusual.
What do you remember about the school or about Fairhope? Was it terribly strict in public school? Or
no, it was not, really.
Okay.
It seemed so, but it really wasn't. It was not, we had a lot of fun, like I think people were in organic school had. We just had to do things that had grades, and that kind of thing.
Right.
And two things that stand out in extracurricular activities. One was that I played football, and I enjoyed that very much. And we had a good football team during my years. Well, even before that, they had a good football team in Fairhope. And the other thing was that we had a little band. And Jimmy Lowell got that thing together. Now, he was an organic school grad, and we were mixed as far as those two schools were concerned. There was myself and Milton Coges, who were in the public school, and there was Chester Beatty and Jimmy, of course, and there was Ralph Hoffman, who played the drums. He was in public school, and who else?
Charlie Ingersoll mentioned that he was in that.
Well, this was afterwards.
That's his,
It was what was left over after the group
beginning.
that was in that had graduated from school, that got in the war and all that kind of stuff. But who was another person? Buddy Frederick played saxophone, and we used to, on our own, would rehearse. Now, Jimmy was an inspiration to us and got us started. And at one point in time, we won a amateur contest over at the school, won all of $10 to split among us.
Great.
People started
sodas all around.
Yeah, people started inviting us out to play for dances and things like that. We only knew 2 or 3 tunes, but we play them over and over and over again.
Well, that's what they do today.
Yeah, you're right. And we had an awful lot of fun. And we played for school assemblies and things like that. What was very nice about that was that we did it on our own. It was not a school-sponsored event, although the school principals, that was Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, would encourage us to come and play for assemblies and things like that, which we would do. And the guys in organic would get out to come over to play with us while we were doing that. So that despite the fact that there's always been the talk and the feelings about the contention between the two schools, among a few of us anyway, that just didn't exist. We enjoyed each other's company. Used to remember also going over to Cummings Hall when it was, the old Cummings Hall, and it was a place for people to enjoy, to use in the community. Always had a basketball game or something like that on there, pickup game, and both organic boys and public boys would be doing that. Following graduation, well then of course World War II came along, and I went into the Navy and stayed, and I was in until after my career was not much. I spent all the time that the war was going on in school. I was in the Navy V-12 program. But after the war was over, I had gotten my commission and I was promptly shipped over to Japan. Was part of the occupation forces there. Well, not very eventful.
So what year did you graduate?
1943.
43, okay. Was that about the same time Mark Arnold was at organic, or do you remember?
Yeah, Mark was active. It was, I don't know what year he graduated, but he
seemed
was
like
there.
I read somewhere it was about that time.
Yeah.
Okay.
I did also, during the high school years, I sang in the Episcopal choir, youth choir, that Mrs. Riggs.
Oh yes.
Mrs. Riggs was a fine musician.
Yeah.
And we really had a lot of fun singing there. And that's where I met Eloise. Really, I met her sister Carolyn first.
Okay.
Eloise was younger, it was not, didn't pay much attention to her.
And Eloise is your wife, I might add.
Yes, Eloise is my wife. That came about after World War II when I went to school at the University of Alabama, so did Eloise, and we kind of met again while she was going there and I was going there. A few months later we got married. And she helped me get through school.
And she helped you. Did she ever get through?
No.
Well, she's into other things anyhow. She's so artistic.
She's pretty educated. There's no
Yeah,
doubt
you're
about
right.
that.
Well, of course, she went to organic.
Right. That was one of the strange things about. She'd probably kill me for saying this, but she never did really feel like she was a good student, and that was one of the things that organic was supposed to get you not to care about, but she did, and she was. That's one reason why she quit at the university, was because she really had a hard time, and she was convinced she couldn't make it, and so she just didn't. And,
Well, I had the same problem, although I didn't go to organic much. I went some, but then I went back in my 30s.
I see.
And got my degree.
Very good. Very good. Okay. Well, where are we now?
We're through. You're in the service, and then so what did you do when you got out? How long did you stay in, and what did you do when you got out?
Well, I was in for some 3.5 years at that juncture. Graduated from the University of Alabama in 1948, and then decided that I wanted to become.
How did you crowd all that? 3.5 years? So you must have.
Well, I was in college in the Navy.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And I had a lot of credits I could transfer. Not all of them, but and then besides, when I went to university, didn't start married, but a few months, the second semester, second quarter, third quarter, when I got married, and during that time, I went to school all the time. I mean, it'd be year round.
Yeah.
So it was.
It's faster that way.
Faster that way, yeah. And I took some GED courses, and that helped me get through.
And then when you got out of college and out
well,
of
after I got out of college, I just thought about what I wanted to do, and I decided I wanted to become an insurance actuary. And that required that I take some more math and some special courses from the society, through the Society of Actuaries. I didn't get that far. I did take the extra math courses, did take the entrance exam to get into the Society of Actuaries, and I passed the English part, but flunked the math part, which I was told was not unusual.
Yeah.
But about that time, though, along came the Korean conflict, and I was called back in because I'd been in the Navy Reserve, and found myself in Korea. And actually, we moved to Pearl Harbor. It was the home port, and so Eloise and our child Christopher, first child Christopher, who came over, and while I went to Korea. We were in from
They lived in Pearl Harbor while you were in Korea. Okay.
I was in the service from then, from the middle of 1951 until May of 1953. It was roughly 2 more years. And, we did get to spend 1 complete year in Hawaii while the ship was. After the ship came back from Korea. We had a good time then. That was a lot of fun. Don't have many fond memories of the Korean experience. I was on in a destroyer escort squadron, small ship type of thing, and we participated in what was known as the siege of Wonsan Harbor. Wonsan port was above the 38th parallel, and the intent there was to keep a bunch of North Korean troops pinned down or in the area because they were told that we were going to invade. The Navy was going to, the United States was going to invade Korea through Wonsan Harbor. And we just run those little boats up and down that harbor. A beautiful place, except by the time we got out of there, all the islands were skinned, you know, the bombardments and things
Yeah.
like that. And, one event stuck out in my mind. My daughter Becky was born in Tripler Army Hospital on Hawaii in November of 1952. '51, and I was overseas, and I remember being on the bridge, pitch black, and the messenger coming up with a message saying that my daughter had been born 2 weeks before. It took that long to get the message through.
Mm-hmm.
And the captain said, "Okay, now you've read that, get back to work."
Oh my.
But it
No
was nothing else
celebration.
for me to do but to go back to work anyway.
Suppose so.
So I didn't get to see Becky until after the ship came back to. I correct that again. It was 1952 that she was born, because it was in. I beg your pardon. It's born in '51. We came back from Korea in early 1952, and that's when I first saw her.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have any other children while we were in Hawaii. We came back to Fairhope in 1953.
I didn't remember you'd been here that long.
Yeah.
My goodness. Well, did you leave? Did you
Well,
all live away from here for a while after?
Yeah, after a while. In
Okay.
1953, I went in with Stephen Riggs and R.E. Tuvison. I don't know if you remember those names or
Yeah,
not.
yeah.
Okay. They were electronic specialists. I had, before I'd gone into the Navy, I had gone to radio school for the Civil Service, and had fixed radios down at Lake Charles, Louisiana,
Mm-hmm.
and at the Brooklyn Field. And so I knew a little bit about radios and things like that. So I went in business with them.
I've got a VCR you need to look at.
I've forgotten all that.
Oh, okay.
You know, if you don't use
You're
it,
off the hook.
you lose it.
Yeah.
And that went on for a while, and we finally just couldn't make enough money at that, so we had to go our separate ways. And I, in the meantime, had made application at Brooklyn Field. I was hired on there. And I worked at Brooklyn from 1954 to January 1966.
And was that in electronics or?
No.
Okay.
No, I was in supply.
Okay.
And I'd gotten that job with a lot of help from Mr. Sam Lester. I don't know if you remember
Oh
him.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
He was in charge of personnel, or he was not in charge of personnel, but he had a lot of influence in
Mhm.
personnel. And he kept after me while I was over here working in the radio shop, losing money to try that out, and it worked fine. And,
Yeah.
I was there until January '66, when I transferred to Dayton, Ohio, or to Fairborn, Ohio, which is a suburb of Dayton, and it's right outside Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Continued working for the Air Force until I retired in 1974 from there.
And then you came back to.
Then we came back to Fairhope again.
So you were away for a total of
8.5 years.
8.5. Okay.
Yeah. Now, during that time frame, in 1972, I was accepted into the corporation. And
Single Tax Corporation.
Single Tax
Okay.
Corporation, yes. I had taken the course before we left. And I don't remember whether I had finished the course or not, but Claude Arnold said I did. And when I made the application, and Marvin Nichols, my father-in-law, kept after me for several years after I married Eloise, to look into joining the corporation, and I finally did that in 1972 while I was still living in Fairborn, Ohio. My father had become a member, and I don't remember that date of the corporation, probably in the 50s or 60s. And it was kind of a surprise to me that he had. I mean, I didn't pay any attention to the Single Tax Corporation when I was growing up there. It didn't mean a thing to me. And I didn't know that much to my father, but after I married Eloise, I think somehow or another my father and my father-in-law started getting together. And my dad was at that time in the real estate business. And so that had reason he would come to this office and handling transfers and things like that. And Marvin must have impressed him enough, so did Corny, that he decided that he embraced the idea, the theory, and so he joined. And my father died in 1962, so there was a time frame in there when that membership certificate, nothing happened to it. And,
Yeah. So it transferred to you when you...
Yeah, I was able to use his certificate, and that wasn't the purpose of my joining, that I had a free certificate because I paid my mother $100 for it. And so she didn't, she got...
She got her money back,
Got her
huh?
money back anyway, that's right, although the corporation didn't get the $100. When I retired in '74, I came back to Fairhope. As far as my association with the Single Tax Corporation was minimal to start with, although sometime in there I did do a special study for the Rent Study Committee. Part of the ingredients of the summer system is the presence of civic services, city services, streets, utilities, sidewalks, that kind of thing. And I was asked to go around and check all the places that bordered on single tax land, and determine if these services were still available or had become available, kind of an update type of thing. I did that. Following that, let's see, I think in 1976 or so, the corporation formed what is known as the Review Board, and that was an idea that was hit upon to use to maybe help people with their complaints. There was, during the middle '70s is when the lessees and the corporation started getting at odds with each other. And that it was felt that I don't know who thought the idea, but it might have been Sam Dyson, could very well have been, that it would be good to have a complaint board that lessees could take their complaints to. And I and Lawrence Thomas, and who was the third fella?
I don't know.
I don't know either right now. I'll have to find out. But anyway, we were the first members of the review board, and we weren't very successful in handling the complaints.
No,
lessees.
apparently not.
No.
I think they were deeper and bigger than anybody ever thought.
The people, the lessees who felt that were very much against the corporation, or had built this feeling up, have refused to utilize the review board.
Yeah.
So that was, like I say, it wasn't a success. Okay.
Playing with it here to get you in the center of the...
All right. Fine.
It's okay now.
I don't know how interesting this is, but anyway, the business about the review board and so forth.
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Got a question. Well, I was going to ask you to talk about the reasons for the lawsuit in the first place.
Okay. Well, there was a feeling. I don't know whether to go at this. I think first I'll go at it from how I viewed it in the early 1970s. I felt like it was 100% a case of greed, that the lessees had observed deeded people with deeded land taking advantage of rising prices and things like that, and the Single Tax Corporation wouldn't let them do that. And so they were out to destroy the corporation, which they said they were going to do that in the first organization document, Fairhope Single Tax Lessees Association.
Well, would I be wrong if I said that the rents went up and that
Yeah.
got them really
Well,
agitated.
that was
to begin
one of the
with.
motivating factors. I don't think it was entirely that. Now that when
Okay.
I look back on it, I think that was one that caught a lot of attention.
Mhm.
The rents did go up, and the rents went up. It was facilitated by the advent of a computer program to adjust the rents, help adjust the rents. Prior to this computer program, it was a long, drawn-out manual process to do an update. It required taking traffic counts over a period of time, putting those traffic counts into manual manipulations, getting an idea of where the activity was. The computer system took it depended a good deal on these traffic counts, and I don't know whether traffic counts were all that big a thing prior to the computer system. The corporation had gotten into the habit of raising everybody's rent a % or two or whatever across the board. They failed to look at or could not take the time or didn't have the time to look at the changes in areas and neighborhoods and things like that. Now this computer system that was devised by Monsieur Rockwell and Ruth, but I think it was really the brainchild of Lucille, took advantage of computer capability to take a lot of data and manipulate it rather easily. And they did this, and then they were in a position to promote that idea of a rent change that would correct a lot of deficiencies in the rent system that had existed before. Now, that caused a problem. Every time there's been a major rent system change or something like that, or rent change in the history of the corporation, there's been unhappiness. Now, I can't really say that for the beginnings of the summer system in 1914, when the corporation adopted that seemed to settle rent complaints down, because people were impressed with the scientific system, and they felt like they were not, things were being done on an equalization basis, that this system could do that, and they were convinced of it, so they quit complaining for a while. And but when the computer system went in, there was an action taken by the council to raise the rents considerably, although what they did was try to spread it out over 5 years, and which was, I thought, a fair thing to do, and rather than do it all in 1 year. But what seemed to happen was people knew it was going to be spread out over 5 years. I mean, they're going to have 5 straight years of rent increases. That made them even madder.
Just can't please them.
No, that's true. But there was also problems with subdivision development and so forth. The corporation, and I can't really point to a lot of things, but this is what I understand, that the corporation took the attitude about that time that people that wanted to make the subdivision development far out in the country were not, they had trouble getting approval from the corporation. And the corporation took the view that there should be a even development starting from the center of town and going out, that there shouldn't be any leapfrogging. This is one of the things that a lot of Georgians speak of as being a bad thing, to go way out in the country to start a subdivision, and that means you've got to provide a lot of services way out in the country. You bypass people in the middle. That isn't good planning. People were not interested in whether it was good planning or not. They just wanted to develop.
That's right.
And so there's pros and cons on that. Also, at that time, or before that time, any development took place, we did what would be called improvements to the land.
That's right.
Streets, sewer system, those kinds of things. And we were not in a position to run a sewer all the way out into the country and that kind of thing. And costs began going up to do those kinds of things, went up faster than the rents were coming in, and so we had to cut back on the developments we were doing. In fact, we adopted the policy to say we just weren't going to pay for that kind of stuff anymore. that made people argue, well, why do you want to raise the rent? You're not going to spend the money for the development of the community. That doesn't seem fair. And I think, and then we had a milestone as far as things happening against the corporation was the Dale Crittenden suit. Crittenden wanted to do a subdivision out in section 22, Bay Meadows, and he was first told.
Now, can you say where this is located?
Yeah, it's on the south. It's in the southeast quarter of section 22. It's,
what street is that?
Well, there's Bay Meadows Avenue that runs between 27 Belforce Road and Hall Thompson Road, or Thompson Hall Road, whichever.
Yeah.
Like it's hard to tell what it's going to be.
Signs are up both ways, I
well,
think.
the area south, immediately south of Bay Meadows Avenue, is where the Bay Meadows subdivision is. Mr. Crittenden dealt with one part of that subdivision and handed us a bill to pay for the streets and things and so forth, which we did, even though we told him we weren't interested in doing that. Now, we didn't pay for the extra electricity being, or the electrical supply being put underground. We didn't. Mr. Crittenden had to absorb the additional costs for doing that. Now, we did pay for the utilities going in there that were available at the time, electricity and the streets and so forth. And then he did a second part at the same time. He'd asked us to pave this section road, or half section road, of Bay Meadows Avenue to provide access to that subdivision. And we refused to do that. We didn't have money to do that, as I'm told. And so he put it in. And as soon as he put the road in, we raised the rents, because that was a factor in the rent formula. You have a paved street, the land is more valuable, therefore the rents ought to go up. And he sued us for that.
Okay.
And also for not helping him with the balance of the improvements to the land and the rest of the subdivision. And when the jury, go ahead.
Well, did you have to approve you didn't have to approve his developing the subdivision?
Yes,
in
we
the
did.
first place.
Well, we did.
But you did approve it.
We did approve it, but we did not.
Promise service.
That's right. We did not
Okay.
promise the services. On the first bill he gave us, we paid it. On the second bill he gave us, we didn't pay it. And I think that was kind of, in hindsight, so that was not probably very smooth. But we were being very firm with him at that time. By that time, but when the jury heard, in my opinion, when the jury heard that we let Mr. Crittenden pay for the road and then raise the rent on the people adjoining that side of that road in the subdivision, we lost the case right then and there.
Well, I can also see where you set a precedent by paying him the first time.
That's right.
He had a right to expect that you would pay him the second, maybe.
But it was awfully hard for us to come by, and we did refuse. We were pretty consistent after that about helping people with subdivisions. We never did have a fixed policy about it until much later on.
So this lawsuit, Crittenden suit, happened in the early 70s?
Late 70s.
Late 70s,
Yeah.
okay.
It was before. The suit occurred after I became secretary. It was in the 1980s.
Okay.
It was middle 80s or early 81, something like that. While the other suit was going on too.
Oh, okay.
And the other suit, the big suit, it was just gathering steam. I mean, there were some hearings and so maybe a deposition or two and that kind of thing. But it was the Crittenden suit caught the attention of everybody at that time over the big suit. I said say over it. I don't know. It just didn't seem like the big suit was going anywhere, and it didn't for some time. In fact, our first appearance in court was in 1985, the suit had been filed in
Yeah.
1979.
Mhm.
So it's just on and on and on.
Yeah.
I ran for secretary in 1979 because I had the idea that I would be of help to the corporation. And I had a little bit of knowledge about the rent formula, not an awful lot. Lucere kept that a pretty close secret about a lot of critical things that were involved in it. And he didn't feel like that it was fair to ask him to divulge all the things that went into it, because you just don't ask, for instance, a bridge engineer to explain his formula when he designs a bridge. That's his secret, or his knowledge to
secret,
keep.
huh?
That's right. And that worked against us, in that people didn't understand it, and then we were accused of keeping it a secret, making it a very we didn't sell the people that would have helped us. It turns out later on, I find that people like economists like Michael Johnson of Spring Hill College, who teaches our single tax economics course, he thinks the idea is great, but he says that one of the things that you can't do in the economics trade is have devise a system such as that and then refuse to explain it to other people who may want to analyze it, criticize it, things like that. So it was a fine idea, great idea, and it was probably a very workable system. The details of it are lost now because with Lucere it's went. Apparently his children and others close to him never did find out some of those factors that he threw into the formula that made it come out right.
Mhm.
I may be overemphasizing that, but that kind of thing always works against you in a lawsuit. If you can't explain what you're doing, then they say that you got some ulterior motive for not explaining it, and the court never did agree that we didn't discriminate against country lessees. And don't know why. We talked as long as we could, and gave all kinds of what we considered proof that we weren't discriminating against country lessees, but the court ended up claiming that that's what happened, that we did discriminate against country lessees. And
What was the penalty for that?
Well, it
stop
worked.
discriminating, or
Well,
was there a penalty?
when they wrote the verdict, well, then they talked in terms of you couldn't discriminate against these lessees,
Mhm.
which we agreed.
Mhm.
And we didn't, but they were convinced that we had, and so that helped set the tone of for parts of the suit that we lost were probably worse because of that. I mean, the penalties that were laid on us made it more difficult.
Did you have to give a rebate on taxes, on their rent?
No, we didn't
Or
have to
anything
do
like
that, but we had to pay the attorney's fees for the plaintiffs.
Okay.
And that was quite a large sum of money.
Yeah.
Okay. And we had to put money that was in the land fund had to go back into the rent fund, and that was a different kind of an approach there. One of the things that we had been doing for some time was taking the interest on the rent money investments and putting it in the land fund, and that was in violation of our lease, which says that we will treat the rent fund as a trust for the lessees, and so that was a no-no, and we got penalized for that. But we did put the money back with interest, but we did it only as a result of the lawsuit.
Yeah.
So there was another thing that we were doing that had been doing for 90 years, and that is that when land was developed for lease, we offered the land to members first. That was a right of the members, and you can read that into the Constitution. The court held that since we were using rent money to do the development, we were misusing the rent fund. We should have offered the land to the lessees, because we used their money in essence. Although we're not a trust, we're more of a corporation than we are, than a beneficiary. type trust, we still have to follow what our lease says.
Mm-hmm.
And they made us go back to the specific statement about that being a trust for the benefit of the lessees. That's kind of away from the rent system, but that's
Yeah,
that
that's a
was
legal matter.
that's right. It was a you know real integral part of the lawsuit.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the court did hold, and rightly so, that we had a right to keep on managing the corporation like we saw fit. And of course, the plaintiffs wanted to take over the corporation,
Mm-hmm.
and the court didn't let them do that. Had the right to choose our members as we saw fit. Those two main ingredients there, as long as we observe the rules of the lease as the court has interpreted it for us, well then we're in good shape.
Legally.
Yeah, legally, right. Thank you for saying that. I meant
And that's
that.
very important.
Oh yeah,
Very
true.